Saki mbwembwana kwele mchele kwa kuku kumwaga. Zako na wapenda yatusema nitasikia.
Hi scholars and poets, welcome to the second installment of the poetry series. Just a quick reminder from last time that this is not so much a scholarly introduction to or lecture series about poetry or the history of poetry or anything like that. It's a gym or a lab for poets who want to expand and practice their craft. Each one of these videos, I will offer you a form or a technique, explain it a little bit, and then give you something to try at the end. And if you try that thing at the end, you will have created a poem or part of a poem. Today, we're going to talk about a form called the ballad form. And I'm going to make the case that it is an excellent it's an excellent thing to practice as you're developing as a poet, because it lets you work a number of different muscles that fit poets' practice working. And in order to figure out exactly what this means, we'll start with a basic distinction between two kinds of poetry, free verse poetry and metered poetry. It's a good bet that the poem you wrote at the end of the last video was a free verse poem. That is to say, the lines weren't confined by any particular structure. They didn't have to meet a certain set of criteria, and that's fine. Free verse is an important tradition of poetry. A lot of contemporary and modern poetry is written in free verse, but it's not the only kind of poetry out there. As we all know, there are a bunch of different kinds of poetry that involve specific rhythms and specific rhymes, and that's called a metered poetic form. Meter is just a fancy word for the specific relationship between stressed and unstressed syllables in a poetic line that creates its distinctive music. Just notice with me for a second, if I vocalize the meter da 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 da, that kind of sounds like a waltz. Stress, slack, slack, stress, slack, slack, stress, slack, slack. That's a particular meter. It's actually a hard one. It's a difficult one to sustain over time. Most poetry in English is written in so-called iambic meter, which sounds like this. Da 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 da. Unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. That's iambic meter. Meter is just the word that describes the particular relationships between stressed and unstressed syllables in a given poem or in a given form. The form we're going to talk about today, which actually follows that iambic meter, is called the ballad form or the ballad stanza. And a lot of young poets, a lot of my students will say that they prefer free verse poetry because it gives them maximum amount of freedom of expression. And I can sympathize with them. I sometimes feel that way too. Sometimes it's appropriate to write free verse. But I would make the case that it's very productive and important to practice as a poet these more confined or restricted forms. You have to follow certain rules. And in following those rules, you'll become a stronger poet. The ballad form asks you to follow certain rules. Why would we benefit from trying this then? Let me make the case. The ballad form is a really good way to practice creating rhythms and rhymes and manipulating rhythms and rhymes. Any hip-hop fans out there know that manipulating rhythm and manipulating rhyme, creating interesting rhythms and creating new, fresh, surprising, witty rhymes is part of a successful hip-hop performance. Same with poetry, and this is a great way to practice both of those skills. The second reason, and it's a related one, is that the ballad has a very intimate relationship with songwriting. In fact, the original ballads are themselves songs. And if you write a ballad, if you write in the ballad form, you can almost hand off those words to a songwriter, and he can easily write a tune to set it to music. And so anybody who's interested in songwriting or creating lyrics for musical forms will want to practice the ballad, because it's a very helpful form, almost ready-made for songmaking. So that's the why. Let's think about the what. What is the ballad form? And we'll start with an example. The ballad's a very old form. It was a primary form for storytelling going back farther than we can even date in many cultures. And as the centuries progressed, the ballad form has stayed with us. One of the important uses that the ballad form has been put to is by hymn writers, religious songwriters. And then secular writers after that continue to use the ballad form. But I'm going to start with a hymn, and it's one that many of you might be familiar with, especially if, like me, you were raised in some form of Christian church. It's the hymn Amazing Grace, written by this guy named John Newton, who's a priest in the 18th century. And I'll just read it for you. I'll just read the first stanza. And as I do that, just sort of begin to listen for what music you're noticing, what patterns in stress and emphasis on given syllables. So the first stanza goes like this. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. I've written it out here for us. Just have a quick look at the way it looks on the page. You'll notice that lines 1 and 3 look longer than lines 2 and 4, and that's not an accident. Think about that in a second. So in order to figure out what the meter, what rhythms and music the ballad stanza calls for, we'll need to do something called scansion. Scansion is just a fancy word for figuring out what is the music of a given particular poem. And when we scan poems for their meter, we start by noticing where the stress syllables are. So amazing, for example, 3-syllable word, but the stress is on that second syllable. Amazing. We don't say amazing or amazing. We say amazing. So the stress is on that second syllable. So I'm going to just take this first line and notice all of the stress syllables. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. And then I'm going to notice that all of the other syllables are unstressed, or what's called slack. I'm going to notice that there is a regular pattern here. There's a slack, followed by a stress, followed by a slack, followed by a stress. And it's notated here. A slack, stress, slack, stress. Paired together, each slack and stress syllable is called a foot. That's the basic unit of the poetry. And so you'll see here that there are 4 feet in the first line, each of which has 1 unstressed and 1 stressed syllable. Now if we continue looking at this poem, do the same thing. Saved a wretch like me. Saved, wretch, and me are the stresses. The others are slack. Keep doing this for the rest of the poem. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. We start to notice that there's a very regular pattern of syllables that creates the music of this 4 lines. Each one is a slack followed by a stress syllable, and that repeats on through all 4 lines. The difference is that this one has 4 feet and this one has 3. This one has 4 feet and this one has 3. So that's the first feature of the ballad stanza. It's a 4-line stanza with 4 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, and 3 feet. That's why 1 and 3 are longer than 2 and 4, because 1 and 3 have an extra foot. The next thing we need to notice is the rhyme scheme. Look at the last line of the last word of each line. Sound rhymes with found, and me rhymes with see. The way you notate that is A, B, A, B. Something to notice about a ballad stanza too is that the second and fourth lines have to rhyme. The first and the third don't have to, they can. In this case they do, but they don't have to. So that is what characterizes the ballad stanza. It's meter of iambic, 4 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet, 3 feet, and then the rhyme scheme, A, B, C, B. Now once you know that, you're in a position to start playing around with creating your own ballad verses. And if you do, you'll find that you're practicing your rhythm making skills and your rhyme creating skills. Think about any important story that you might like to tell in a song. Maybe that's your prompt right there. But I'm going to give us a couple of other prompts because one of my favorite poets is Emily Dickenson, a 19th century American poet who uses this ballad stanza in a lot of her poems. She does some weird and wild things with it, but she starts from the basic form of the ballad stanza. And Dickenson wrote lots of different kinds of poetry, but there were 3 kinds of things that she typically did in her poetry. One thing that she did was take a piece of common sense and then argue with it. I'll give you an example. She wrote a poem that went like this. It's just 2 stanzas, and it's in the ballad meter, so listen to the music as well as the words. They say that time assuages. Time never did assuage. And actual suffering strengthens as sinews do with age. Time is a test of trouble, but not a remedy. And if it prove, then it prove too, it were no malady. Notice what she did there. She quoted a piece of common sense. They say that time assuages. It's a fancy way of saying time heals all wounds in the first line. And then she uses the rest of the first stanza and the second stanza to argue against that, to say why that's wrong. That common sense idea that time heals all wounds is not true. So that's a fun prompt to try. Pick a piece of common sense that you think is questionable or you know is wrong, quote it in the first couple of lines, and then write some stanzas after that arguing against it or demonstrating why it's not true. Something else Dickinson liked to do was write riddles in her ballad stanzas. She would take an object, sometimes a common object, a species of bird that she might see outside of her window, or an animal that she was familiar with sort of rambling around in Massachusetts as a little girl. And she would describe that thing without ever saying its name, like you do when you make a riddle, and then send that poem to one of her friends to see if they could guess the answer to the riddle. There's a famous one called A Narrow Fellow in the Grass, which is about a snake. But she never says it's about a snake. She just describes it with metaphors and similes and then leaves it to us to figure out that she's writing about a snake. What I would challenge you to do here at the end is write a couple of stanzas in the ballad form. Either tell a story that you think it's important to tell. That can be your prompt. Write an argumentative poem against a piece of common sense that you're not convinced of, would like to question, or know is BS and want to expose as BS. Or try a riddle. Pick an object or a thing. It can be abstract or concrete, and describe it without naming it to see if your reader can guess. Before I send you off to do this, a couple of tips. The first is to be patient with yourself. Finding the ballad music, that iambic music, it takes some practice and some time. And you might find that you struggle a tremendous amount with the first couple of stanzas. But I can promise you that if you try hard to find the music in the first couple of stanzas, as frustrating as it may be, there'll be a moment where it'll start to click and you'll start to feel it more intuitively. and then the stanzas will come much easier. Notice that because lines 2 and 4 have to rhyme, you're going to have to create a rhyme for each of your stanzas. And the fourth stanza may feel the most frustrating because that's the place where you're under maximum constraint by the form. It has to be 3 feet, it has to be iambic, and it has to rhyme with line 2. One of the things that I like to do when I'm working with rhyme is whatever word I chose to end line 2 with, I'll write a list, 15, 20, 30, as many words as I can think of that rhyme with that word. And then I'll have a batch of fresh rhymes to think about as I write that fourth line. Write many different versions of that fourth line too, especially if you're not sure you've gotten it right the first time. Try 3, 4, 5, 10 versions of that line, and then later pick the one that seems right, that's the best, that really belongs there. Finally, think about this as an experiment in productive constraint. It'll help with the frustration factor, and the frustration factor may be high. A ballad form is a productive constraint for a poet, just like the rules of chess are a productive constraint for a chess player, or just like the rules of soccer are a productive constraint for a soccer player. If you could touch the ball with your hands, it wouldn't be soccer. If you didn't have to rhyme and didn't have to find the music, it wouldn't be writing poetry in the ballad form. And what you'll find is, if you submit to this constraint, at first it will feel limiting and frustrating. But as you get better and better at it, it will feel like something that you can use and manipulate to your own advantage, something that you have the power to mold. Just like the great virtuoso soccer player uses the rules of the game to express his performance at the highest possible level. So know that if it feels frustrating, that's entirely appropriate, because it's not easy. But with practice, it will get easier and easier, and you'll feel freer and freer, even though you're still working within the rules of that game. All right, folks, give it a go. It's good to see you, and I'll be back soon with another installment.
Nanipaga moyo nikianza kulia chozi nafutia.